So this afternoon, we're going to kick things off with two speakers, Amanda Lenhart and Roger McNamee, who's going to be zooming in. And these are two people who have thought really extensively about the dangers that arise from social media and technology, and what might be done to enhance users' well-being. I'll note that, unlike the other sessions, we're going to have Amanda talk, and then we're going to go straight into Roger's talk. And then there's going to be 30 minutes of dedicated discussion time where you should all feel free to ask questions of both of them. Okay, so our first speaker is Amanda Lenhart. She's the director of the Health and Data Program at the Data and Society Research Institute. Today, Amanda is going to be talking to us about the challenges of building healthy technology for young people. So let's give her a round of applause.
Thanks, Sherry. Thank you, Bob. Thanks for everyone, the whole conference organizers, for having me here today. Yeah, and as my title says, we're going to talk about healthy tech for young people, but also a lot of the things we're going to talk about very much apply to everyone, not just young people. So I spent a lot of my career thinking about and doing research on families and technology, and particularly with teenagers. And a lot of the research I've done was about how do teenagers feel about it, how do families feel and think, and what do they do with tech? And we've heard a lot over the years of a lot of different ways in which tech is wonderful for young people, but also a lot of the different ways in which it really didn't serve their needs, in which it caused fear and harm. And so we spent a lot of our time thinking about, okay, what tools can we give to families and to kids to help them have a better experience and avoid harm in these online spaces and with these technologies that they're using. And I would say recently, I've kind of come to the revelation of why are we placing the burden of making sure kids stay safe and young people stay safe and people stay safe on the kids themselves and on people themselves. And I think it's time for us to start thinking about how we democratize and how we spread some of the responsibility for some of these issues around safety and harms to users on these platforms across different people and entities in the ecosystem. And so as a part of that, my colleague Kelly Owens and I, over the course of the last couple of years, did a piece of research in which we went and we started talking to people inside tech companies about how they think about and design for digital well-being for young people. And I will say that, and so the report that came out of this is called The Unseen Teen, The Challenges of Building Healthy Tech for Young People, as you can see in the title of this whole talk. And we did this through semi-structured interviews with current and former employees, so people had moved around, on a lot of the platforms that maybe you've heard of. We offered complete anonymity to all of our participants, so I can't name platforms, I can't name people, but I can tell you they ranged from C-suite to junior people. They were in lots of different kinds of roles, from research roles to product designers, trust and safety folks, engineers, and policymakers. And again, they worked at a really wide range of platforms, from some pretty small ones to, again, some of the largest. And the real sort of central question that we went into this research with was, how do social media platform companies think about and design for the well-being of young people? So that was the central question. I will say, as we went through these interviews, we didn't get to young people until pretty late in the conversation, partly because we wanted to sort of set up the conversation. So we ended up talking about lots of different kinds of people who are both served and not served by some of the design choices on platforms. So the first problem we encountered in this research is that it turns out it's really hard to define digital well-being. And in fact, no one really agrees about what it means. And so this is just a small selection of how different scholars have defined digital well-being. And one thing I will say about Data and Society, where I'm doing this work and where I work currently, is that it's highly interdisciplinary. So we have economists, we have political scientists, we have sociologists and anthropologists and bioethicists and psychologists all on staff. So we tend to pull from a lot of different social sciences when we're thinking about literatures that we're looking at. So you can see here, what ends up happening in practice is that, I realize this conference is really focused on psychology, but the definitions, even amongst academics, really do range widely. Some do focus in quite specifically on psychological functioning. Others take a more holistic view that involve physical well-being, that involve contextual well-being. And even beyond the scholars, we found that actually the people we talked to themselves in the interviews were like, there wasn't a lot of consistency in how people described it. And often when we'd ask people to describe it, they'd sort of sit for a while. They wouldn't really quite know what to say in the interviews. And in fact, this particular person came back and said, well, based on my relationship with this particular individual had a council of adolescents that they talked to as a part of their job. And this particular person said, essentially, when I talk to the young people, they don't even think that digital well-being should be separate from physical, from their well-being entirely. They don't intellectually separate it out. And you also get these issues where, because it's so undefined, people are just bringing their own biases and their own choices and their own beliefs to this set of definitions and these lenses. And so when you have the conversations in tech companies, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a second, oftentimes people are talking at cross purposes. And so what that actually means in fundamental practice is that people just decide not to define it, and they focus inside these companies on things that you can measure, right? For those of us who are inside tech companies or have been or know them, tech companies are a place that really value metrics and quantifiable things. KPIs, MAUs and DAOs. And so when you're thinking about well-being, the thing you can really control is how long people spend on your platform and how much time, how often they come and how long they spend there. But it turns out when you dig into screen time, time doesn't tell you enough, right? So I can take a 2-hour block of time and I can spend it really differently. I can spend that 2-hour block of time on a subreddit for my rare disease and come out of it feeling like empowered and knowledgeable and really good about myself. I can also take that same 2 hours of time and I can spend it doom scrolling on what's left of Twitter and get out of the end feeling pretty bad about the state of the world, right? So and we're not even sort of pulling on valences here around how interactive am I, how much am I talking to people, how active, how constructive am I on these platforms. So screen time it turns out is incredibly reductive, right? But at the same time, like, people are really wrestling with this inside these companies. So what ends up happening, because of this focus on metrics, which also ends up manifesting in a focus on growth, which plays into how, again, companies have shareholders and VCs who you have to pay back, you have a fiduciary responsibility to. So you need to continue to grow. And that means you're going to focus on the biggest group of users that you can find. And so what ends up happening is companies create what we call an imagined average user. And this person is generally white, is generally male, and an adult. And fascinatingly, we even talked to some folks who had done academic work before joining a platform in which they focused on kids. And then they got to this platform that they were working on, and it was like that work had never been done. And we were like, well, didn't you work on kids? And they're like, oh, yeah, I guess I'm just really designing for me and my friends, right? And so there was very much, I'm going to design for people who are excited about technology, which is me, right? I want to build for people who like what I have to offer. But it means that you miss the adolescents in particular, which is strange because in many cases, adolescents, a majority of at least American adolescents and adolescents in all over the world might be using your platform, but because adolescents themselves are only a small slice of a population, they may only make up 15% or 10% of your actual user base. So you're like, I got other fish to fry. I'm not going to spend time dealing with teens or kids because they're hard. And the other issue, too, is that focusing on the averages misses some things called person-specific effects. And there's a group of researchers at the University of Amsterdam led by Patty Valkenburg. And Ina Baines is also a member of her team. And this is in reference to Ina Baines' Nature article from 2020, in which they're starting to sort of release the fruits of like 5 or 6 years of research. And it's research with mostly Dutch adolescents and Dutch young adults, looking at, in this very large and major methodology, I'll leave you to dig into the methodology yourself in the paper, but essentially that finds what they're called differential susceptibility. That essentially means there's a subgroup of people who have experiences on social media that generally leave them with a very negative sense of themselves afterwards. It's about 9% in their research. They found about another 20% who leave most of their social media interactions feeling great, feeling much better, having a more positive sense of subjective well-being is the measure they were using. And then about 70% of people were like, nah, I'm good. Like, either way, it doesn't really matter. Like, I feel about the same when I leave and when I come. And so that's part of what they're saying when we start looking at a population, which is why we have a lot of data that we've been working with social media and adolescent well-being that suggests that, like, doesn't seem to make a difference, or has a very modest negative effect that's barely statistically significant. And it's because we're missing these small effects on a particularly small group of people who are harmed potentially, or who do have negative experiences, and who we need to focus on. And I think that's one of the things we miss when we look at these bigger, broader populations. Again, and as I've said before, a lot of why this happens is because of this focus on growth, this focus on metrics, which means that focusing on these large populations and how they grow and how you can grow them ends up being the thing that you focus on. But then we focus on stickiness, and we miss the smaller groups of people. And this doesn't have to just be teenagers. It can be trans folks. It can be disabled users who need accessibility assistance. It can be people of color. It can be any one of a number of people who are otherwise not well represented, particularly by the people who are designing the technology. So another thing that we heard in this study is that companies kind of don't want to know. So often under the guise of privacy, companies will decide, you know what, it's better if we don't know, then we don't have to fix it. And this comes out of a concept that McGoy has piloted in the bioethics sphere, which came from my colleague Kelly, who is a bioethicist who I worked on this with. And the way we saw this manifest in the companies was in three pieces. One, which is not collecting the data. In particular, age data was one that was salient for us in this study, but not collecting any data about users, or very minimal data about users. Collecting too much data, which is a problem that we see on platforms like YouTube and other platforms where there's so much data, you would need millions, hundreds of thousands of people to moderate it, which is why we have AI attempting to help moderate, and those are some of the solutions we're trying to put into place. But essentially, you kind of can't know it all because so much data is coming into your system, which is a choice that companies are making. And that, I think the other part that's, I think, quite critical is that companies create internal structures that absolve people inside the companies of having to think about the digital well-being of users, right? So you locate that responsibility in your trust and safety team or your child safety team, and then everybody else is like, trust and safety didn't tell us, or maybe they're going to come in at the end of the process, and so, yeah, maybe we'll listen then. And we'll talk a little bit about like what types of structures inside the companies actually were effective, but it basically said that other people they can kind of wash their hands of having to think about these issues. And so this is a quote from somebody at one of the platforms we talked to, in which they essentially say, like, look, we know we have kids on our platform, but we decided not to know. And we also decided not to look at other data, external data, that would also tell us about who's on our platform. So it really is something that we did hear about a fair amount. Not at every platform, I will say. This is not something that I think crosses all platforms, but a subset of the ones we talked to, this was certainly an issue. And so I think it's really important to say that there are people within these platforms. We'll get to some exceptions and some current events in a second. There are people within these platforms whose job it is to think about young people and well-being. And I should also state here that when I talk about social media platforms in this study, some of the platforms we also talked to would be best described as social gaming platforms as well. There's a gaming element to them. So these folks are inside the org, and the org has brought them in and has staffed these teams. But a lot of the time, what we heard when we talked to these folks in particular was that they lack power to stop anything from happening inside the org, right? So they can like stand up and wave and jump up and down, but at the end of the day, because often what they're suggesting is about reducing user time on the platform and changing how users' behavior, which potentially could result in a reduction of revenue. And so what we hear, and this is a quote from one of the participants, about how they're seen as blockers. And what they do is they use sort of soft power, like, let me think about the motivations of the decider in this place, and I'll think about what's important to them, and I will use that to craft my arguments to try to convince them to do this thing that we know for a lot of other reasons is the right thing to do. And so then, of course, we have today from the news. Anybody can tell. So this was from, I love this. This is from a one of the new AI generating engines. You can guess the prompt. I'll tell you the prompt. The prompt is Twitter, dumpster fire, dark alley, Casper, David Friedrich. So we're going for Painterly. But I do want to say that I think we're looking at real time in a moment in which we've seen at some very large platforms, Meta in particular, and Twitter especially, where all the people who do this work, not only are they disempowered, they're just gone. They're just gone. They've all been fired, or they've been laid off, or the teams that think about these things have been severely trimmed in the case of Meta. So not only do we have now a front row seat to what happens when, we've already can see what happens when these issues are diminished or not taken seriously, and now we're going to see what happens to platforms over the next couple of weeks when you don't have these people thinking about it at all. So a lot of the questions we got when we did this work is like, what do we do? What works? Are there things we can do? And so we broke it up in this study into external levers, so things that people outside companies could do to convince companies to change. And then we have some internal levers as well. And these all came from things that people we talked to recommended and said actually worked in the meetings, in the moments, in the workplace. And so outside pressure broadly is helpful. It turns out it works. Civil society, regulators, media, can make change, and particularly bad press. Unfortunately, we heard a lot about tragic circumstances, especially related to children, caused a lot of soul searching within companies. We had one company in particular in which was accused of being, I don't think this is identifying, accused of being, sadly, having a role in the suicide death of a child. And people inside the company were themselves devastated to hear this. There was a lot of internal work that they did to make changes based on what they heard, right? And so it did make change. Now, it's horrible, right? The level that it took to make this change is quite dramatic. But also avoiding even more negative media coverage that's less severe than that also was very motivating for many of the people. But they also, the folks we talked to inside the companies were like, journalists also need to be fair, right? Like a lot of times we're starting to feel like we're the punching bags right now, and we feel like people are just taking cheap shots at us. So we would ask that journalists have a responsibility to cover these kinds of stories reasonably and with nuance. Also, it turns out the public failure of other corporations, so maybe, here we go, of other corporations can spur action, and particularly collaboration across companies. So companies generally won't collaborate, don't want to. They're competitors, they don't want to share their personal secrets, but there are some things that they do collaborate on right now, particularly CSAM, which is child sexual exploitation images, or child abuse images, which is horrible and is one thing that almost everyone can agree is super problematic. And so there is quite a bit of collaboration across all of these big social platforms, social gaming companies around eliminating that. So there is a model for that, and these kinds of things can drive more of that. Other external levers, pressure from civil society. In particular, we heard a lot about rankings. Companies didn't want to look bad on rankings from organizations that they cared about and that had a fair amount of good public goodwill. So ranking digital rights, a project of New America came up in some of our interviews. And then regulation, right? So it turns out threat of regulation is almost as effective as actually regulating, but there was a lot of internal concern and changes that ended up being made where there were credible threats and moves towards regulating these companies, and also thoughtful regulation. So we heard a lot about regulations that had previously been imposed, particularly COPPA in the context of our youth work, that essentially were ineffective, created deserts of content because creators were just avoiding places, the highly regulated places, to go for places where it was much easier to go. So being thoughtful about any regulation that does get applied is really important. If you're inside one of these companies, it turns out one of the key things you can do is embedding empowered folks into product teams from the very beginning, right? People who think about the well-being, who think about the user's perspective, who think about the well-being of users and reducing harm to users from the beginning, inject them in from ideation to launch. And then you don't have this problem, which we heard about all the time, which is people helicoptering in. You bring the trust and safety team in at the very, very end of your design process, and they try to blow everything up. And you're like, you're blowing everything up. And they're like, yes, we could have talked about this a lot more earlier, right? So the teams that had actually made this change in their structure in the couple years prior to us, they talked about this pretty substantive reduction that they had in launches that they'd had to pull back, and rollouts where they had really big problems like massive bad press type problems. And the other thing, too, which is a sub-idea of this, is make this everybody's responsibility, right? So you're going to put this embedded person on your product team, but also everybody on the team has to think about this, right? It can't just be like, well, trust and safety will handle it. No, you all need to be thinking about it. And then, like, escalate to legal, right? Escalate to the trust and safety team when you get to something where you're like, ooh, we want to encrypt our messaging app, but then we're going to have a lot of child exploitation images on it. What should we do? Like, go talk to them then. But at least be starting to think about some of these tensions and challenges. And finally, this is not something that hasn't been said 9 million times, is we need more diversity in the tech sphere. We just need more of it, and we need to retain them. You also need to do the research, and I think other folks have talked about this. You need to go out and you need to talk to lots of different populations and get their sense. And so if you have them inside your company and then you go and talk to them, you're going to do a much better job of starting to build for them. So this is the report, as I said, that's based on it. You can find it at Data and Society. And this is another report that I would also commend to you, which is kind of a prequel to this, which is really about unpacking some of the myths that we saw in Silicon Valley around what it takes to build, what healthy tech really means. It's really short, it's only 4 pages, but it's got a lot in there. And so I would also commend that to you. And with that, I think we're ready.